This video was made in partnership with NordVPN. If you'd like to get an exclusive NordVPN deal with an extra 4 months for free, make sure to go to nordvpn.com/wildworld or click the link below. You can try NordVPN risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee if you want to give it a try. When it comes to man-eaters, I think a lot of us think of lions and tigers. Of course, these big cats have been involved in many notable cases, and while man-eating is thankfully rare, or relatively rare, these cats certainly have, and sometimes still do, attack and eat people. But there's another, smaller big cat that can be just as lethal. Like the others, man-eating leopards aren't very common, but unfortunately, when one of these large cats turns to man-eating, they can be very proficient at it. If you look at a top 10 list of individual man-eaters with the highest kill counts, you get the usual offenders, tigers and lions, and a few crocodiles. But half the list is actually leopards. In fact, while the Champawat tiger occupies the number 1 spot for most people killed by a single animal, the number 2 spot is occupied by a leopard. Thankfully, man-eaters aren't something I personally have to be concerned about. However, as someone who spends a lot of time online, cybersecurity is something that I have to be aware of. That's why today's video has been made in partnership with NordVPN. There are some common and frankly alarming threats that NordVPN can provide simple solutions to. Public Wi-Fi is a great idea, but it could leave you open to a man-in-the-middle attack, where people can steal sensitive data. But with NordVPN, you can encrypt your online traffic. They have a threat protection feature that can recognize malicious links, which sometimes I do get sent. They also have a dark web monitor to alert you if your credentials are appearing on hacking sites. Threat protection can also scan downloaded files for malware or ransomware, and it even blocks malvertising. For extra online protection, go to nordvpn.com/wildworld or click the link below to get the creator deal, where every purchase of the 2-year plan comes with an extra 4 months for free. This is currently the best deal for NordVPN. They also have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free today. There is a remote district in northern India known as the Almora district, in the division of Kumaon. In the early 20th century, the people living in the area were spread out with miles of jungle in between the different small villages, connected not by roads, but small paths and trails through the thick vegetation. In April of 1910, a young married couple were sleeping in their home in their second-floor bedroom. Though it was night, it was still hot in April, and the one opening to the room, the door, was left open as they slept. Leaving the door open may have let the heat out, but it let something much worse in. In the dead of night, a large male leopard crept into the room and grabbed the woman by the throat. The man woke up to see his wife being dragged away by the large cat and tried to grab her and pull her free from the animal's grasp. The leopard was trying to take the woman outside, and the man grabbed his wife, and with his other hand he grabbed the door frame to pull against the leopard, who, in response, shoved a claw into the woman's chest, trying to secure its prey. They struggled and fought, and somehow the man was able to get his wife free, slamming and locking the door behind him. The leopard clawed, scratched, and slammed at the door, trying desperately to get in, while the couple cowered in the corner of the hot room. The leopard attacked the door all night long. By daybreak, the leopard had left, or at least seemed to have left. But the man didn't know what he should do. His wife was in a bad state, but their house was miles away from anyone who could help. Difficult to contact someone in rural India in 1910. The only way to get help would be to actually physically go and get help. But that had problems. What if, while moving through the jungle, the leopard attacked him? What if, while he was away, the leopard came back for his wife? The door held for one night, but leopards have gotten through locked doors before, which was another issue. Waiting in the house was not only problematic because of his wife's injuries, but also the leopard might return, and this time it might get through the door. The man went outside into the light of day, perhaps trying to figure out what he should do next, when he saw another man coming towards the house. This approaching stranger was armed. The young frightened man ran down to the approaching stranger, fell to his knees, and begged for his help. Thankfully for him, the stranger was a man named Jim Corbett. And he was here for the leopard. Those familiar with man-eaters probably know the name James Corbett. He was an Anglo-Indian hunter, tracker, naturalist, and of course, author, famous for his books on man-eaters. When it came to dealing with man-eaters in India in the early 20th century, Jim was the guy to call. In fact, he would have come for the Leopard of Panar sooner, except he was preoccupied with dealing with the tiger of Champawat. I made a video all about that. But in April of 1910, he was in pursuit of the man-eating leopard, and he of course wanted to help the man. While difficult to know the best thing to do in a difficult situation, the man mostly feared the return of the leopard and wanted Jim to stay and guard them for the night. Jim agreed. The man wanted him to stay in the room with them, but he declined. Although Corbett had a strong stomach, the smell of the wounds going septic in the heat were more than he could bear, but also he wanted a good vantage point. So he decided to stay outside. Moving some of the wood away from the outside wall, he sat back against it and looked out into the jungle. He instructed the man to leave the door open, and as the sun went down, he held his rifle and waited. In other books written by Mr. Corbett, he describes how he had pretty good night vision and that, to him, the night was never truly dark, except in the case that the night was overcast by a storm. Be that as it may, he was aware of just how more proficient a leopard was at peering through the night. In some ways, a leopard's vision is actually slightly worse than humans. We can apparently see more fine detail than a leopard, at least a bit more. Leopards, however, have a wider field of view due to their big round eyes, helping them have a greater awareness of their surroundings, but the real advantage comes from their night vision. Cats, as well as some other animals, have a biological reflector built into their eyes, called the tapetum lucidum. It basically helps the retina by giving light-sensitive cells a second chance to detect light, improving vision in low light, and giving them that iconic eye shine. Leopards also have a high density of rods in the retinas, which are light-sensitive cells that also contribute to seeing well in low light conditions. Basically, the leopard had a much better chance of spotting Jim than he had of spotting it. But clearly, it was a risk he was willing to take. This was no regular leopard after all. Due to the remoteness of the area, it is difficult to know the exact date of when the leopard turned to man-eating, though in the years that it did, it had killed 400 people. No single leopard in recorded history before or after had killed that many, and the only other individual man-eater with a higher kill count was the Champawat tiger. Corbett sat as still as possible with his back firmly against the outer wall of the house, staring into the jungle before him. In the last 24 hours, he had barely eaten anything, only a few berries, but perhaps from the fear-fueled adrenaline, he was able to stay awake the entire night. As dawn broke, he knew he had to leave. The man was still gripped by fear, but there wasn't much more Jim could do by staying, and the woman needed urgent help, so he left the couple. He said farewell to the man and ventured through the jungle, back towards a bungalow he had been staying at with his men. When he did, the men had already packed up and were ready to leave. Since Jim had disappeared for 24 hours, they were afraid of the worst and thought they had to go and find him. While he was explaining what had happened, to the others, a road overseer came along on a pony. Jim gave him a letter to deliver to the town of Almora to send immediate medical help for the injured woman, which he did, but by the time help arrived, it was too late and the woman had passed. The road overseer did tell Corbett about another recent kill that led him to the temple of Devadatta, and inside was a priest. Corbett approached the man to ask him about the leopard. The priest spoke with him, and after some time, Corbett asked if the leopard would receive protection from the temple, like a tiger he'd previously failed to shoot. Exactly how much stock Jim put into the superstitious, I cannot say for certain, but from his writing, he seemed relieved that the priest told him that the leopard would receive no such protection, and that the shaitan, or devil, had killed many worshippers that frequented the temple. And though Jim now had to leave, upon his return, he would pray that Corbett would hunt it down and kill it. Jim had to leave the area and return to his job, working for the railway, where he was responsible for overseeing the shipping of goods. It would be a number of months before he could return to the area and try and hunt down the leopard again. He had learned some things about the animal, though. In general, most people never even saw the leopard attack. Its prowess for stealth meant that most of the time, someone would just disappear before being found dead, killed, and partially eaten in the jungle a few hundred yards away. However, the leopard was growing bolder, recently going into homes in search of its next victim. While Corbett hadn't seen the man-eater himself, at least not yet, he had found pug marks on the ground and could tell that the leopard he was after was a large male. With leopards, males tend to be larger than females, with males generally growing somewhere between 130 to a little over 140 centimeters, so somewhere between 4 to maybe 4.5 feet in length. And that's just the body. The tail adds another 70 to 90 centimeters, or about 3 feet, though some big males have been apparently over 8 feet long, and weigh somewhere between 50 to 70 kilos, 110 to about 151 pounds. I have heard reports of some leopards getting closer to 80 kilos, or 176 pounds, but as far as I can tell, the largest one on record is closer to maybe 70-ish kilos, 150 to 160 pounds, but perhaps some others do get larger. Months went by, and Corbett was still unable to return to the area, and while the leopard was still at large, it was difficult to get clear updates about attacks. The odd thing about the Leopard of Panar is that it never got much coverage or attention in the Indian press, but Corbett had a pretty good idea as to why other leopards, such as probably the most infamous of all, the leopard of Rudraprayag, got a lot more attention despite having a lower kill count. To quote Jim himself, he said it was entirely to the fact that the Panar leopard operated in a remote area far from the beaten track, whereas the Rudraprayag leopard operated in an area visited each year by 60,000 pilgrims, ranging from the humblest in the land to the highest of all, of whom had to run the gauntlet of the man-eater. It was these pilgrims and the daily bulletins issued by the government that made the Rudraprayag leopard so famous, although it caused far less human suffering than the Panar leopard. As September rolled around, Corbett finally had the chance to make a second attempt to hunt the man-eater. On the 10th of September at 4 a.m., Jim, his servant, and 4 other men set off on the 28-mile march to Almora. A difficult trek only made harder when the skies opened up and rain poured down on the men as they made their way to town. When they got to Almora, they stayed in the bungalow of a kind man who lit fires for them to dry their clothes. At breakfast the next morning, a mason Jim knew named Panau came to him and asked if he could join the group, as he wanted to visit his home in the Panar Valley, but didn't want to travel alone, knowing there was a large cat hunting people in the area. Corbett agreed to let him come along, especially since Panau had knowledge of the area and could help plan the best routes through the jungle. They left Almora and entered the man-eater's territory. of the Panar Valley. Finding a leopard within hundreds of square miles isn't easy, and the men had to go from village to village trying to get any news on recent movements from the leopard, walking for miles and miles each day, traveling on the small paths through the thick vegetation, trying to find any information on the leopard. On the fourth day of the search, the men arrived at a small village where the headman informed Jim that there had been a recent kill, not at that village, but at another village called Sanauli, on the far side of the Panang River. All the recent heavy rain had flooded the river, and without bridges, it would be difficult to get across. The headman advised Jim and his crew to stay the night, and that he would give them a guide the next day that could show them a safe area to cross the river. It was late in the day, and the men had been walking for miles, so they agreed to stay the night. The headman had a building with a few empty rooms on the upper floor for the men to stay in, but Jim noticed a vacant room on the ground floor and decided to take that room so that only one of the upper rooms needed to be used. The ground floor room was a bit messy, but with the help of the others, they were able to clean it up, and after his bed was laid out, Corbett quickly fell asleep. But he was going to get a big scare the next morning. When the sun rose over the village the next day, a slight sound woke Jim, and opening his eyes, he saw an older man sitting there, staring at him. The man wasn't exactly in the best of health, and after informing Jim that this was his room that he had used for years, he also told him that he had leprosy, which gave Corbett a bit of a shock. He dressed quickly and left with haste, not stopping to get breakfast until they approached a small stream, where Jim instructed his team to clean all of his bedding, and then he went further downstream, found a small pool where he could wash himself. He stripped off and scrubbed himself and his clothes with carbolic soap, and left his clothes on some nearby rocks to dry them before returning to the group. One might wonder why the headman in the village, or someone else who lived there, didn't warn Jim about sleeping in that room. From Jim's writing, it seems that the people in the area didn't really consider it to be that big a deal. To quote Corbett, "Being fatalists, the people look upon the disease as a visitation from God, and neither segregate the afflicted nor take any precautions against the infection. So quite evidently the headman did not think it was necessary to warn me that the room I had selected to stay in had for years been the home of a leper." No disrespect to the man with the ailment, but I can understand how Jim felt anxious about being exposed to a contagious disease. We know more about the disease today, and according to the World Health Organization, quote, "prolonged close contact over months with someone with untreated leprosy is needed to catch the disease. And also today, while it's still around, it is curable." Exposure scares aside, it was time to move on, and there was still a river to cross. The headman had kept his word and provided the group with a guide. He was a short man. Jim estimated him to be about 4 foot 6 inches tall, though he had a, quote, "great barrel of a body and long dark hair." Jim asked the man if it would be difficult climbing to get to the river, and the man replied that the trek would be flat, holding out his palm to show him the route would be even. However, almost right away they descended down into a steep valley and then up another steep hill, with loose footing as well as thick shrubs and vegetation, and as the men finally reached the top of the hill, they were drenched in sweat. At the top, they could see out further into the jungle and saw many more hills in between them and the river. Panau, the mason who was trying to return home to his family in the Panar Valley, was not happy about this, especially since he was carrying a bunch of presents back for his family, as well as a big massive coat. He informed the guide that if he was going to make them climb every hill in the region, he could carry the coat. The guide, who was unfazed by the treacherous trek, obliged with the request, or demand, and folded the coat up and strapped it to his body. The men continued on. Up and down through the valleys they went, until finally they came to the river. Jim didn't seem to like the look of it. It was about 40 yards, or 36.6 meters wide, and was rushing violently. It seemed hazardous, but the guide assured him it was the best place to cross, and it would be fine. Jim and Panar went first. Taking off their shoes and socks, they rolled up their trousers, linked arms, and started to cross. The current was strong, and the rocky footing underneath didn't help. Multiple times the men nearly slipped, and Jim remarked that he stubbed his toe on a number of occasions. But they did it. Arm in arm, the two of them made it across. The guide decided to go next, and went by himself. Though the river came up to the thighs of Corbett and Panar, the river climbed up to the waist of the shorter man, and midway through crossing, he slipped, and the current took him. As the river dragged the man away, Jim watched helplessly, as on the rocky ground he could barely walk without his shoes on, never mind run. However, that didn't bother Panar. He threw down the bundles he was carrying and sprinted along the river after the man. 50 yards down the river, a slab of rock jutted out onto the water, and Panar raced onto it, lying flat on his stomach with his hands stretched out. The guide was hurtling towards him. Panar would have one chance, or the man's life would end in the river. As the guide came past, Panar reached in and grabbed him by his long hair and battled against the current before finally ripping the man out of the water and onto the rock. After a moment to catch their breath, they went over to Corbett. Corbett, amazed at the heroism of Panar, complimented him on his bravery, to which Panar looked at Jim and said, "It was not his life that I wanted to save, but my new coat that was strapped to his back." Jim decided that was enough excitement for one day, and after the rest of his men safely crossed the river, they made camp for the night. The next day, Panar decided he was close enough to his home to go the rest of the way by himself, although the guide, who didn't want to try crossing the river again just yet, decided to go with Panar. Jim and the rest of his men carried on towards the village of Sanoli, the last known hunting spot of the leopard. When they arrived, the villagers were glad to see them. The village of Sanoli was built on the side of a hill overlooking a valley. The land was cultivated with paddy fields, though there was a patch of about 20 acres or so of brushwood. As Corbett sat down to have breakfast with some of the residents, they told him more about the leopard. Tragically, 4 people had been killed in the last few months, all of them at night. The leopard would drag its victims into the brushwood and eat them without disturbance, as the unarmed people did not have the means to go after the leopard. There was a certain boldness to this cat. The brushwood where it went to eat was only a few hundred yards away from the village, and it clearly had little fear of eating so close to the other people. The last attack had happened just 6 days before Jim had arrived, but perhaps most importantly, the villagers informed Jim that right then, as they sat around having breakfast, the leopard was still in the brushwood. Jim had purchased 2 goats from the surrounding villages and set out to bait the leopard out of the wood. He remarks in his book that hunting a leopard or a tiger can be difficult in favorable conditions, and these were not favorable conditions. The brushwood was so thick and dense that any large cat or animal with any sense of hearing would hear him approaching instantly. There weren't too many good vantage points near the brushwood either, so he tied 1 goat close to the wood and the other to the bottom of a platform that was near the village. The platform was higher up and open on all sides with a thatched roof. As night came, he could hear the 2 goats bleating to each other through the darkness, and as light rain began to fall, he hoped that if the leopard approached the village, it would rather eat the goat than the human on the platform above it, and after a time, he fell asleep. When dawn came, 1 goat was still making noise, but the other one, the one closer to the brushwood, had fallen silent. Jim came down from the platform and crept towards the wood. When he got to the edge, he saw the goat, or what was left of it. He knew the leopard was, in fact, still in the 20 acres of brushwood. He went back to the village to talk more with the villagers and figure out a plan. He He asked if there was any other nearby area of cover where the leopard might escape to if it was forced out of the wood. But the locals told him that the land was fairly open for miles around, which was both a good and a bad thing. It meant that during the day, the leopard would probably not come out into the open, and they would know its rough whereabouts. The issue was that while sometimes hunters or shikaris organize a beat, which is basically where a large crowd of people make a big ruckus by shouting and banging and doing whatever they can to be loud to scare an animal out and into the path of a hunter's crosshairs. Corbett was too nervous to use this tactic here though, as he thought if the leopard felt like it had nowhere else to go, it might turn and try to attack one of the beaters. He did attempt to try and track it through the brushwood, but it was to no avail, and his prediction was correct. He did find pug marks though, and was quite certain they were left by the same animal that had terrorized the couple back in April. In his book, Corbett describes that he was struck with an attack of malaria, and for the next 24 hours, he lay on the platform in the grips of a fever. As soon as he shook the fever, it was back to trying to hunt the man-eater. Upon surveying the brushwood, he noticed an old oak tree, leaning over so that he could get up it with relative ease. There was one branch just large enough to support Jim, but only barely, and it was very difficult and uncomfortable. But with no other trees nearby and the platform too far from the brushwood, this tree would have to do. He had his men bring thorn shoots that were 10 to 20 feet long and place them on either side of the tree to help him balance and give him something to lean on. The branch on which Corbett was perched was about 15 feet above the ground. He had the men secure the shoots to the tree with long, thick, strong rope and waited on the branch. The second living goat had been tied to a stake between the tree and the brushwood. The other men hung around for a little while, talking and smoking, until the night started to come and they returned to the village, leaving Jim alone in the tree with his double-barrel shotgun. The night grew darker and he waited, watching the goat. The goat went silent and turned towards the tree. He waited for the leopard to creep out to attack the goat, but the night went on and on without incident. At one point during the night, he felt a gentle tug at the chute he was leaning on, and then another, and then a growl. The man-eater didn't want the goat, it wanted the man. The leopard growled and snarled and tried to rip the shoots off the tree, shaking Jim violently as he tried to hold on to the branch. He later remarked that he owed his life to the decision to strap the shoots to the tree. The leopard continued to attack the shoots, trying to displace Jim, who just barely kept his balance. He feared if the leopard jumped up and took a swipe at him, that even the gentlest of touch would cause him to fall. After some time unable to get the man, the leopard turned its frustration and attention to the goat. Jim had hoped he would have been able to shoot the leopard before it got to the goat, but now it was so dark he could only see flashes of shapes as the leopard mauled the animal. He aimed the shotgun as best as he could and fired. There was a grunt and the leopard ran off, and then silence. 10 or 15 minutes later, his men called out as to whether or not they should come. He told them it was okay to do so and to bring pine lanterns. About 20 men in all came out carrying torches, and a few climbed up the tree to help him get down. He told them he had shot and wounded the leopard, but how badly he had no idea, and he said he would look for the trail in the morning. The men, however, did not like his plan. Why not go after the leopard now if it was injured? Why not just finish the job? But Jim knew an injured animal is a dangerous beast, and injured or not, the night belonged to the leopard. The man-eater was in his element. After much arguing, though, against his better judgment, Jim agreed to pursue the big cat in the dark. He told the men to walk behind him in a line, holding the torches up high so he could see, and he instructed them that if the leopard charged, not to run away. Without the light, shooting the man-eater would be very, very challenging. Corbett and the men began walking through the fields, following the trail of blood left behind by the animal. The night was still until it wasn't, and a growl and a groan split the night air as the leopard decided it had had enough of being pursued. Upon hearing the angry man-eater, the men behind Jim turned and ran, all 20 of them. Jim was alone in the field as the big angry cat charged towards him in the dark. A few had dropped their torches, giving Jim a little bit of flickering light as the killer bounded towards him. It was enough for him to know where to point his shotgun, and he fired off multiple shots. The night was silent again, until Jim heard the voices of his companions in the dark, discussing whether or not Corbett would be angry with them, but he wasn't. After all, the men were unarmed, and he even remarks in his own words that if he had been one of the torchbearers, he probably would have ran too. He knew they would feel embarrassed, though, so he went over to examine the leopard, and he didn't mention the running away. The man-eater was well and truly dead, and he instructed the men to use bamboo poles and rope to bring the leopard back to the village. Jim went back and had a hot cup of tea before going to sleep. The people of Sanoli and the people in the valley of Panar slept soundly that night. The question has to be asked, why did this male leopard turn to man-eating? And to be honest, I don't know. And I don't know that there is a clear, obvious answer for this one. Often in the case of man-eaters, the animal in question is sick, old, or injured and unable to hunt its regular prey, so it turns to something a little easier to catch. However, in this case, the male seemed relatively healthy. Corbett theorized perhaps it had fed on victims of severe cholera, as there had been an outbreak in that area around the time. Perhaps it got a taste for human flesh, though again, I'm not really sure. Man-eating leopards are rare, and generally, leopards don't hunt humans. Even in Corbett's books, he notes that it is unusual for these animals to do as such, although I'm sure it brought him joy to stop more people being killed by man-eaters. I don't think he particularly liked to hunt and kill tigers and leopards. He once wrote about how, although he enjoyed the pursuit and the tracking of these animals, he noted he'd much rather shoot one with a camera than a gun. But when it comes to man-eaters, he had to use the gun. The Panar leopard was a menace to the region and certainly posed a challenge to track down. But in the years to come, Corbett would have to hunt down another leopard, one that was much more cunning and much more challenging to hunt. But perhaps that is a tale for another day. Anyway, massive thank you to my patrons and members for your continued support, and a big thank you to NordVPN for partnering with me for this video. Remember to go to nordvpn.com/wildworld or click the link below and get the creator's deal with an extra 4 months for free. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.